In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the 1878 Texas Panhandle, a woman's compassion could be her greatest strength or her most fatal mistake. For Elspeth Monroe, a widow clinging to her isolated homestead, the line between the two blurred the day. A flash flood washed a dying Kiowa brave to her doorstep. Nursing him was an act of mercy. But what she didn't know was that this man, Tene Angopte, was no random stranger. His clan's shaman had seen her in a vision, and a decision had already been made. She wasn't just his savior. She was his intended mate. The sky over the Texas Panhandle had been the color of a day-old bruise for 3 days straight. Elspeth Monroe, a woman whose spirit was as resilient as the sod walls of her small home, watched it with a practiced eye. The air, thick and heavy, tasted of dust and distant rain. It was the kind of weather that made the loneliness feel like a physical weight, pressing down on the roof of the small cabin her late husband, Thomas, had built with his own 2 hands, before the fever took him a year ago. Her world was a small one, circumscribed by a meandering creek to the south and a line of low, stony hills to the north. It was a life of hard-won solitude. She knew the language of the wind, the cry of the red-tailed hawk, the subtle shift in the prairie grass that signaled a change in seasons. She was 32, though the sun and the grief had etched lines around her eyes that suggested more. Her hair, a fiery red that Thomas had loved, was usually tied back in a severe bun, a concession to the ceaseless wind. This evening the wind wasn't just a whisper, it was a rising scream. The clouds which had been brooding on the horizon converged directly overhead. The first drop of rain was fat and cold, striking the packed earth with a puff of dust. Then another and another, until the sky tore open. It wasn't a cleansing spring shower, it was a deluge, a furious assault that turned her small patch of cultivated land into a muddy quagmire, and the nearby creek into a roaring brown beast. Elspeth secured the door, the bar thudding into place with a familiar sound of safety. She lit the lantern, its golden glow, pushing back the oppressive, water-streaked gloom. For hours the storm raged. Thunder cannonaded across the plains, each clap vibrating through the soles of her worn leather boots. She sat by the small hearth, a Hawken rifle resting across her lap, listening. In this land, a storm could be a cover for anything, a panther, a band of rustlers, or a Comanche raiding party, though the latter had become blessedly rare since the army had pushed them further south. It was close to midnight when the storm's fury began to recede, leaving behind a world gasping and dripping. The roar of the creek, however, was louder than ever. It had swollen its banks, consuming the willows and cottonwoods that lined its edge. It was then she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm's aftermath. A sharp, cracking noise like a great branch snapping, followed by a human cry, choked off almost immediately. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to douse the light and wait for dawn. This land did not reward foolish curiosity, but the sound had been one of utter desperation. It scraped at the edges of her conscience. Thomas had been a good man, a man who would have gone to investigate. Living alone had hardened her, but it hadn't extinguished the part of her that he had cherished. With the rifle held tight, she unbarred the door and stepped out onto the saturated ground. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and ozone. The moon, a sliver of bone white, broke through the tattered clouds, casting a weak, ethereal light on the scene. The creek was a torrent of churning, muddy water, carrying with it uprooted saplings, debris, and something else. Something dark tangled in the roots of a fallen cottonwood that had been swept downstream. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a man. He was caught in the tree's grasp, half submerged in the racing water, his body limp. Even from a distance, she could see the dark matted hair and the glint of buckskin. An Indian. Her mind raced. The Kiowa territory was to the north. Encounters were rare and seldom peaceful. The stories told in the nearest settlement of Wheeler were filled with blood and terror. To bring one into her home was to invite a death sentence, either from him if he woke, or from his tribe who might come looking. Or worse, from any white man who might discover her harboring a savage. She stood frozen, the cold mud seeping into her boots. "Leave him," the voice of survival whispered. "The creek will finish the job." But then his head lolled to the side, and in the moonlight she saw his face. He was young, no older than her Thomas had been. His face, though battered and smeared with mud, was starkly handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. A deep gash ran from his temple down his cheek, bleeding sluggishly. He was dying. A wave of something stronger than fear washed over her, a stubborn, defiant compassion. She would not let a man die on her doorstep, no matter the color of his skin. Cursing her own foolish heart, she slung the rifle over her shoulder and waded into the churning water. The current was powerful, pulling at her skirts and threatening to sweep her feet from under her. It took all her strength to reach the fallen tree. He was unconscious, his skin cold to the touch. A large, ugly bruise was purpling on the side of his head, where he must have struck a rock. His left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Untangling him from the branches was a Herculean task. His dead weight was immense, and the water fought her every step of the way. Gasping, slipping, she dragged him inch by painful inch out of the water and onto the muddy bank. For a moment she knelt beside him, chest heaving. Now what? She couldn't leave him here. A coyote or a wolf would find him before morning. The cabin was 100 yards away. Gritting her teeth, Elspeth looped her arms under his shoulders and began to drag him. The journey was a nightmare of mud and straining muscles. She fell twice, her face pressed into the wet earth, the smell of rain and blood filling her senses. But she got up and she kept pulling. Finally she hauled him over the threshold of her home. She barred the door behind them, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He lay on the floorboards, a broken piece of the wild prairie deposited in her small, orderly world. Water and mud pooled around him. She stripped off his wet buckskin shirt, her movements clinical detached. His chest and arms were a road map of scars, old and new. A particularly wicked one, a puckered, star-shaped mark on his shoulder, looked like it had been made by a bullet long ago. Working by lantern light, she did what she could. She cleaned the gash on his face, her touch surprisingly gentle. She found other cuts and bruises, tending to them with rags and a basin of clean water. The leg was the worst part. The bone was clearly snapped below the knee. She wasn't a doctor, but she'd set a broken leg on a calf before. With a deep breath, she gathered splints from the kindling box and tore strips from a clean sheet, one of the few good ones she had left from her marriage. Setting the bone was a brutal, sickening task. She had to put her full weight on his leg to pull it straight. He groaned a deep, guttural sound from the depths of his unconsciousness, and his body arched in agony. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and she felt a wave of nausea, but she finished the job binding the splints tightly. She couldn't lift him onto her bed, so she dragged him close to the hearth and covered him with every spare blanket she owned. Throughout the long night she sat in her chair, the rifle back on her lap, watching him. She watched the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was a Kiowa brave, a man who, on any other day, she would have viewed as a mortal enemy. But tonight, in the quiet intimacy of her cabin, he was just a man broken by the storm. And she, Elspeth Monroe, a lonely homesteader, was his only hope. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the window, She realized her life had irrevocably changed. She had invited the wilderness in, and she had no idea if it would be her salvation or her ruin. The next few days bled into one another, marked by the rhythm of her patient's fever. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his sleep troubled by muttered words in a language she didn't understand, and violent shivers that shook his powerful frame. Elspeth was constantly at his side. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips, bathed his feverish skin with cool cloths, and kept the fire stoked, fighting the chill that seemed to emanate from his very bones. The fear never truly left her. Every time a floorboard creaked, or the wind howled a little too loudly, her hand would stray to the rifle she kept propped against the wall. She was acutely aware of the danger she was in. She was a woman alone, with a wounded warrior from a tribe known for its ferocity. Yet as she cared for him, another feeling began to take root, a profound sense of purpose. Her grief for Thomas had hollowed her out, leaving her adrift. Now this man's life depended on her. The simple, urgent necessity of it pushed the loneliness back. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She awoke from a light doze in her chair to find him watching her. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and startlingly clear. There was no delirium in them, only a calm, assessing gaze. Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. She froze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He tried to sit up, a grimace of pain flashing across his features as he felt the pull of his injuries and the heavy splint on his leg. He looked around the small cabin, taking in the neatly stacked shelves, the stone hearth, her empty bed, and finally his gaze settled back on her. He said nothing. Elspeth slowly rose to her feet, keeping a careful distance. She gestured toward the pot on the hearth. "Broth," she said, her voice raspy. She pointed to herself. "Elspeth." He watched her, his expression unreadable. He looked at the splint on his leg, then at her. He touched the cleaned and stitched gash on his temple. A flicker of something, understanding perhaps, passed through his eyes. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He pointed a finger at his own chest. "Tene angopte," he said. The name was guttural complex, the syllables catching in his throat. Seeing her struggle to repeat it, he simplified. He tapped the prominent, jagged scar that curved above his right eye, a pale white line against his bronze skin. "Hawkman Edjas," he said the English word clear and distinct. It was a start. A name, Hawk. Their communication became a slow, patient game of charades. She would point to the water bucket and say the word. He would repeat it. He in turn would tap his chest and say, "Hongya," the Kiowa word for hungry. She learned it meant he wanted the rabbit stew she'd made. A fragile, unspoken truce formed between them. He was a patient patient, never complaining, his stoicism immense. She was a diligent nurse, her movements efficient and devoid of any wasted sentiment. As he grew stronger, she saw the man beneath the warrior. She watched him one afternoon as he meticulously resharpened her skinning knife with a whetstone she'd given him. His hands, though large and calloused, moved with a surgeon's precision. He took nothing for granted, treating her meager tools with a respect that surprised her. He would watch her work, mending a shirt, kneading dough with an unnerving intensity, as if committing her every action to memory. One day, she came back from checking her rabbit snares to find he had dragged himself across the floor and was repairing the handle of her wood axe, which had been loose for weeks. He had used a thin strip of wet rawhide from his own ruined moccasins to bind it, and as it dried, it tightened to a grip stronger than any nail. She stood in the doorway, stunned. He didn't look up, just continued his work. It was his first act of contribution, a silent acknowledgement of his debt to her. A thank you, offered in the language of work that they both understood. The fragile peace was shattered a week later by the sound of hoofbeats. Not the frantic beat of a single rider, but the steady, purposeful clip-clop of 2 horses. Elspeth's blood ran cold. She motioned frantically to Hawk, who with a grim understanding pulled himself into the darkest corner of the cabin, drawing a blanket over his body. He was still too weak to fight, and his broken leg made escape impossible. Elspeth grabbed her rifle, took a deep breath to steady her hands, and opened the door just a crack. 2 men sat on horseback 50 yards away, surveying her homestead. One was a large, slovenly man with a florid face and a greasy leather vest. She recognized him instantly, Lyle the foreman for Bartholomew Corrigan. Corrigan was a cattle baron who had been buying up or forcing out all the small homesteaders in the area. He owned the vast swathe of land to the east and had made no secret of his desire for her property with its precious creek. The other man was younger, with a mean, pinched face and shifty eyes. "Mornin', Mrs. Monroe." Lyle called out, his voice oily and overly familiar. He nudged his horse forward. "Just checking on our neighbors after that big storm." "I'm fine, Mr. Lyle." Elspeth said, her voice colder than she felt. She kept the rifle angled downwards, but her grip on it was white-knuckled. "As you can see." Lyle's eyes roamed over her property, lingering on the repaired fence line, the healthy-looking patch of corn. "Heard some strange rumors," he said, letting the words hang in the air. "Talk of a Kiowa war party getting scattered in the storm. Some of Corrigan's boys had a run-in with them up north, lost a few head of cattle." He leaned forward in his saddle, his piggy eyes narrowing. "You ain't seen nothing unusual, have you? A stray Indian, maybe?" The lie came easily to her lips, born of pure, unadulterated defiance. "The only thing I've seen is too much rain and a creek that nearly washed away my coop. If you're looking for lost cattle, I suggest you do it somewhere off my land." The younger man snickered. Lyle's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Feisty. Mr. Corrigan admires that. He also admires this little patch of green you got here. Sent me to tell you his last offer still stands. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. Another storm of fire. This is hard country for a woman alone." The threat was naked, brutal. Elspeth's chin lifted. "This was my husband's land, and now it's my land. You can tell Mr. Corrigan I'm not selling. Not now, not ever." Lyle stared at her for a long moment, his gaze hard. Then he shrugged a gesture of false indifference. "Suit yourself." He wheeled his horse around. "Have a nice day, ma'am." She watched them until they were small specks on the horizon. Only then did she close the door, her back sliding down the rough wood until she was sitting on the floor. Her body was shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so potent it nearly choked her. From the corner, the blanket rustled. Hawk had heard everything. He pushed the blanket aside his face, a mask of cold fury. His eyes weren't just watching her anymore. They were seeing her, truly seeing the steel that lay beneath her calm exterior. In that moment, something shifted between them. She was no longer just his reluctant nurse, and he was no longer just her secret patient. She had defended him, lied for him, and placed herself squarely between him and men who would kill them both without a second thought. They were allies bound by a shared enemy. The trust between them was no longer fragile. It was being forged in the fires of a common threat. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became a world unto itself, a silent partnership, blossoming within its sod walls. Hawk's leg began to heal the bone, knitting with the slow, steady patience of nature. Though he still couldn't put his full weight on it, he refused to remain idle. He would sit by the door for hours, fashioning sophisticated snares from vines and sinew, their design far superior to her own clumsy traps. He taught her through gesture and example how to read the faintest tracks in the dirt, how to tell the age of a deer print by the sharpness of its edges. In return, she shared her world with him. She spoke to him constantly, not caring if he understood the words. She told him about Thomas, about their dream of building a life here, about the biting loneliness that had followed his death. He would listen, his dark eyes fixed on her, his expression intense. He was learning her language, not just the words for water and fire, but the cadence of her voice, the sadness that clung to her like a shadow. A comfortable routine settled over them. She would work the garden while he repaired tools or fletched arrows from branches she gathered. They ate their meals in a comfortable silence, a shared understanding passing between them that needed no words. One evening, she looked up from her mending to find him staring at her, a strange, unreadable emotion in his eyes. He reached out and gently touched a lock of her red hair that had escaped her bun. The touch was feather-light, reverent, and it sent a jolt through her that was entirely unexpected. She pulled back, flustered, and he immediately withdrew his hand, a flicker of what looked like confusion on his face. The moment passed, but it left an invisible hum in the air between them. The wilderness she had invited into her home was no longer a threat. It was a companion. She no longer felt like a woman alone against the world. They were two people, a unit surviving together. It was a simple, starkly beautiful existence, and she found herself dreading the day his leg would be healed and he would leave. That day came sooner than she expected, but not in the way she had imagined. It was a hot, still afternoon. A hawk, the bird, not the man, circled high overhead. Elspeth was weeding her corn patch when she felt it, a sudden prickling on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She slowly straightened up her hand, instinctively moving to the pistol she now wore, holstered at her hip. They were on the rise to the north, silhouetted against the unforgiving blue sky. 3 riders. They were not cowboys. Their posture, the way they sat their ponies with an easy fluid, grace the lances that a couple of them held upright, it was all Indian. Kiowa. Her blood turned to ice. They had come for him. The door of the cabin opened, and Hawk emerged, leaning on a crude crutch he had fashioned. He stood beside her, his body tense. He raised a hand palm forward in a gesture of peace. The riders began a slow descent toward the homestead. As they drew closer, she could see their faces painted with ochre and black. They were warriors in their prime, their eyes hard, their expressions grim. They pulled up their ponies 20 yards from the cabin. The one in the center, clearly the leader, was an older man, with a face like a weathered rock, his long gray-streaked hair in braids. His gaze was ancient and piercing, and he seemed to look right through Elspeth into her very soul. The man to his right was younger, with a face so similar to Hawk's, he could only be his brother. But where Hawk's features held a quiet intensity, this man's were set in a mask of stern disapproval. His eyes, when they fell upon Elspeth, were filled with open hostility. The older man spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. It was a stream of Kiowa directed at Hawk. Hawk replied, his own voice, steady, respectful. Their exchange was long, complex. Elspeth stood frozen, understanding nothing but the gravity of the moment. She was an outsider, a white woman caught in the middle of a tribal council. Finally, the old man fell silent. His unnerving gaze settled on Elspeth. He spoke again, and this time Hawk began to translate his English, slow and halting, pieced together from the words she had taught him. "This is Satanta," Hawk said, gesturing to the old man. "He is shaman, wise man of my people." He then indicated the angry-looking warrior. "This is Pautehau, my brother. Elspeth nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Setanta, he had a vision. Hawk continued, struggling to find the right words. Before the storm, a vision from the spirits. He looked at Elspeth, and for the first time she saw a deep conflict in his eyes. He saw a woman, alone, in a house of earth, hair the color of prairie fire at sunset. His gaze flickered to her red hair. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. This was no coincidence. My bloodline. It is important to my clan, Hawk said, his voice dropping lower. The vision said my mate, the mother of my son, would be this woman. She would bridge the two worlds. She would make our people strong. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Elspeth stared at him, her mind struggling to process the impossible words. Mate, the mother of his son. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a chance encounter. It was a prophecy. They hadn't come to punish her for harboring one of their own. They had come to collect the woman their spirits had supposedly chosen for him. The vision said I would be found by her broken... Hawk went on his eyes, pleading with her to understand. And she would heal me. When our people came, they would know she was the one. Elspeth's shock gave way to a surge of pure, indignant fury. The quiet companionship, the fragile trust, the unspoken bond she thought they had been building. Was it all a lie? Was he just waiting for his people to arrive and claim her like a piece of property, won in a bet with the gods? No. She whispered the word, sharp and brittle. She looked from Hawk's conflicted face to Setanta's impassive one, and then to Pautehau, whose expression was now one of grim satisfaction, as if her refusal was exactly what he had expected and hoped for. He saw her not as a prophesied bride, but as an unworthy white woman, an insult to his brother and his tribe. No, she said again, her voice gaining strength. She took a step back, her hand dropping to the butt of her pistol. It was a foolish, futile gesture against 3 armed warriors, but it was all she had. I am not a prize. I am not some character in a shaman's dream. I saved your life because you were a man in need of help. That is all. This is my home. You will leave. Setanta watched her, his ancient eyes showing no surprise. Pautehau let out a short, derisive grunt, but it was Hawk's reaction that struck her to the core. He looked utterly devastated, torn between the duty to his people and the woman who stood before him, defying his entire world. The unspoken truth was finally laid bare. It was not a truth of budding affection or mutual respect. It was the truth of a Kiowa prophecy that had crashed into her life along with the storm, and it threatened to drown her just as surely as the floodwaters had threatened to drown him. The air crackled with a tension thicker than summer humidity. Elspeth's hand remained on her pistol, a desperate anchor in a sea of disbelief. Pautehau smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. He spoke in Kiowa, his tone sharp and dismissive, gesturing toward Elspeth as if she were a stubborn mule. Hawk answered him, his own voice, low and strained. The brothers' words became a heated exchange, a rapid-fire volley of guttural sounds that radiated anger and frustration. Setanta the shaman remained silent on his pony, his eyes closed, as if listening to a conversation far more important than the one happening in front of him. Finally, Hawk turned back to Elspeth, his face a mask of anguish. "My brother does not believe the vision," he said, his English more clipped than usual. "He says a white woman cannot be Kiowa. He says you are unclean." A raw, primal anger surged through Elspeth, overriding her fear. "I don't care what he thinks," she retorted, her voice shaking with rage. "And I don't care about any vision. I am my own person. I make my own choices. And I choose to remain here, alone, You helped me around this homestead, and for that I'm grateful. Now your debt is paid. You are healed. You can go." She had meant the words to be a clean cut, a final severance, but seeing the deep hurt that flashed in Hawk's eyes, she felt a pang of regret. It was a complicated, messy pain. She was furious at the presumption of his tribe, at the idea of her life being decided by a prophecy she had no part in. But she was also hurt that the connection she thought had grown between them might have been nothing more than his duty, his patient waiting for the fulfillment of a spiritual contract. Setanta opened his eyes. He spoke, his voice calm and resonant, cutting through the tension. Hawk listened intently before translating. "He says the spirits do not care for the color of skin," Hawk said quietly. "They care for the strength of the heart. He saw your heart when you pulled me from the water. He says the choice is not his to make, or my brother's. The path was shown. How we walk it is up to us." With that, Setanta turned his pony, and without another word, he and Pautehau rode back up the rise and disappeared over the horizon. But Hawk remained. He stood on his crutch, a lone figure caught between two worlds. "I will not force you," he said the words, costing him a visible effort. "This is your home. I honor that." He looked around at the small cabin, the tilled earth, the fruit of her labor. "But the man Corrigan, he will not stop." Elspeth's anger deflated, replaced by the cold, familiar dread of her other, more tangible problem. "I'll handle Bartholomew Corrigan. He has many men," Hawk stated simply. "You are one woman. I have a rifle." She shot back, though the bravado felt hollow even to her own ears. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, then turned and limped toward the small makeshift shelter he had built for himself against the far side of the cabin, a lean-to of scrap wood and canvas. He was not leaving. He was not forcing the prophecy upon her, but he was not abandoning her to the threat he had overheard. He was making his own choice, independent of his tribe's decree. The realization unsettled her. He was staying not because of a vision, but because of a clear and present danger to her. Life fell into a new, strained rhythm. The easy companionship was gone, replaced by a polite, formal distance. They worked together as before, but the silence was now heavy with unspoken things. Elspeth felt a constant churning conflict within her. Part of her wanted to scream at him to leave and take his impossible prophecy with him. Another smaller part of her was terrified of the day he might actually do it. The inevitable escalation with Corrigan came a week later. It began not with a bang, but with a vile act of cruelty. She awoke one morning to find her water well fouled. Someone had dumped the carcass of a diseased calf into it during the night, poisoning her only source of clean water. The stench of death and decay hung in the air. It was a message signed by Corrigan, as surely as if he had left a note. Rage and despair warred within her. The creek water was still silty and unsafe to drink without boiling, a time-consuming process. The well had been her lifeline. As she stood staring into the contaminated shaft, tears of sheer frustration blurring her vision, Hawk came to stand beside her. He looked into the well, his jaw tightening. Without a word, he took the shovel from her numb hands and began to dig a new well site downslope from the cabin in a spot where he had noticed the ground remained damp even in the heat. For 2 days he dug relentlessly, his healing leg protesting his body covered in sweat and dirt. Elspeth worked alongside him, hauling buckets of earth, her anger slowly transforming into a grim determination. They were finishing the new well, having just hit a seam of clean, cold water, when Lyle and 2 of Corrigan's other thugs rode up. They reined in their horses, taking in the scene the new well, and Hawk, his buckskin trousers and bare chest marking him clearly as Kiowa. Well, well, Lyle sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. Looks like the lonely widow ain't so lonely after all. I knew I smelled something rotten around here, and it ain't just that dead calf. Hawk straightened up slowly, the shovel held loosely in one hand. He was no longer the broken man from the storm. He was lean, powerful, and his eyes burned with a cold fire. "This is a warning, Lyle," Elspeth said, her voice dangerously low. "Get off my land." "Or what?" One of the other men laughed. "Your pet Indian gonna throw dirt at us." He spurred his horse forward, intending to ride right over the new well. He never made it. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Hawk dropped the shovel, seized a rock the size of a loaf of bread, and hurled it. The rock struck the man's horse square in the chest. The animal shrieked in pain and reared violently, throwing its rider hard to the ground. Before the others could react, Hawk had closed the distance, pulling the dazed man to his feet and pressing the point of Elspeth's skinning knife, which he always carried, to his throat. The second thug reached for his pistol, but stopped when Elspeth cocked her rifle, the sound loud and final in the tense silence. Lyle stared, his florid face pale. He had come expecting to intimidate a lone woman. He had found a fortress defended by a silent, deadly warrior, and a woman who looked ready to kill. "Go," Hawk said the single word, a low growl. "Tell Corrigan, this land is protected." Lyle hesitated for only a second, then yanked his horse's reins, turning it so sharply it stumbled. He and the remaining thug galloped away, leaving their groaning companion in the dust. Hawk released the man with a shove that sent him sprawling, then retrieved his knife. The confrontation was over, but they both knew it was only the beginning. Corrigan was not a man to take such a challenge lying down. He would be back, and next time he would come with more men, and with killing in mind. As Elspeth looked at Hawk standing guard over her home, she realized the shaman's prophecy was a house divided. She had rejected the part about being a mate, but she could no longer deny the truth of the other part. Her fate and Hawk's were now inextricably and violently intertwined. The prairie held its breath. For 3 days after the confrontation with Lyle, an unnatural quiet settled over Elspeth's homestead. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude, but the tense, listening silence before a battle. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. They spoke little, but a new understanding flowed between them. They were no longer a homesteader and a Kiowa brave. They were a garrison of 2 preparing for a siege. Hawk was relentless. He spent the daylight hours fortifying the homestead. He reinforced the cabin door with a heavy wooden beam. He dug a shallow trench along the front of the cabin, a rudimentary but effective rifle pit. He gathered stones into piles at the corners of the house, ready to be thrown. His movements were economical and purposeful, the actions of a man who had fought for his life many times before. Elspeth worked with him, filling grain sacks with earth to block the window, and cleaning her rifle and pistol until they shone. She baked a double batch of bread and filled every available container with water from the new well. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the work kept it at bay. On the 3rd night, the attack came. There was no moon. The darkness was absolute, a thick black velvet that swallowed the landscape. Elspeth was dozing fitfully in her chair when Hawk, who had been keeping watch outside, slipped silently back into the cabin. "They come," he whispered. Her eyes flew open, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, rhythmic drumbeat of war. She grabbed her rifle and moved to the small peephole she and Hawk had carved next to the window. Outside, she could see nothing but impenetrable blackness, but she could hear it, the faint, muffled jingle of a bridle, the soft thud of a horse's hoof on turf. "How many?" she whispered back. Maybe 8. 10. Hawk replied, his voice calm. He was checking the load in a pistol he'd taken from the man he'd accosted days earlier. It was old, a Colt dragoon, but it was functional. He now had a knife, a pistol, and his own formidable strength. Corrigan is with them. The knowledge that the man himself was out there leading the attack sent a chill down her spine. This was it. He wasn't sending his thugs. He was coming to finish the job himself. "You stay here," Hawk commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Shoot at the flash. Do not show the light." He slipped back out of the cabin as silently as he had entered, melting into the darkness near the corner of the house. Elspeth pressed her eye to the peephole, her rifle barrel resting on the sill. The waiting was the worst part. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Then a voice cut through the night Corrigan's. "Munro, I know you're in there, and I know you've got that redskin with you. I gave you a fair offer for this land. You chose to spit in my face. Now I'm just going to take it. Send the savage out and I'll let you walk away." The lie was so blatant, it was almost laughable. Elspeth remained silent. Her finger curled around the trigger. "Have it your way," Corrigan roared. A torch suddenly flared to life about 60 yards out, held aloft by one of his men. In its flickering demonic light, she could see them, a line of mounted men, their faces grim rifles held at the ready. The first shot came from the darkness near the cabin. It was Hawk's pistol. The man holding the torch cried out and dropped it, plunging the scene back into chaos. Immediately, the night exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Orange flashes lit up the darkness as Corrigan's men fired wildly at the cabin. Splinters flew from the wooden walls. A bullet punched through the planks just inches from Elspeth's head, and she flinched back, her ears ringing. She took a calming breath, aimed at the last flash she'd seen, and squeezed the trigger. The Hawken rifle bucked against her shoulder, its roar deafening in the small space. A scream from the darkness told her she'd found her mark. She reloaded with frantic, practiced movements, her hands working automatically. Outside, Hawk was a phantom. He was not where they expected him to be. He fired the pistol again from a different position, then melted away. He was using the terrain he now knew, as well as she did. The woodpile, the shallow creek bed, the shadows of the outbuildings to his advantage. The attackers, expecting a simple siege against a cabin, were now fighting a guerrilla war against an unseen enemy in the dark. For what felt like an eternity, the battle raged. Muzzle flashes, screams, the thunder of guns, the terrified whinnying of horses. Elspeth fired again and again, aiming, firing, reloading, a grim automaton of defense. She lost track of time, of how many shots she had fired, of how many men were still out there. Suddenly, a new sound joined the fray, a high, piercing war cry from the north ridge. Elspeth's heart leaped into her throat. More of them. But this cry was answered by another, and then another. To her astonishment, she saw 3 figures on horseback, charging down from the ridge straight into the flank of Corrigan's men. It was Pautehau Hawk's brother and 2 other Kiowa warriors. They tore into the disorganized attackers with lances and hatchets. Pautehau, who had watched from afar, consumed by his conflict, had made his choice. He would not stand by and let his brother be killed by these men, regardless of the white woman at the center of it all. His arrival turned the tide. Corrigan's men caught between the fire from the cabin, the ghost in the darkness, and the furious charge of the Kiowa broke into a panicked rout. But Corrigan was not with them. In the chaos he had dismounted, and under the cover of the firefight had crept to the back of the cabin. With a furious roar, he kicked in the rear door, the one they hadn't had time to properly reinforce. Elspeth whirled around as the big man filled the doorway, his face a mask of rage, a huge revolver in his hand. She tried to bring her rifle to bear, but he was too fast. He lunged, knocking the gun from her hands. She scrambled backward, her hip hitting the table. He was on her in a second, his massive hands grabbing her, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer. "Now you bitch!" He hissed, his breath foul. "You're going to watch me burn everything you love before I kill you." Just as his grip tightened, the main door burst open. It wasn't kicked in, it was simply flung aside. Hawk stood there, silhouetted against the dying muzzle flashes outside. He had no pistol, no knife. He was covered in dirt and blood, some of it his own. His eyes, fixed on Corrigan, were pits of black fury. Corrigan turned, shoving Elspeth aside, and raised his revolver. But Hawk was already moving. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, a predator closing in on its prey. He didn't try to dodge the gun. He moved straight into it, grabbing Corrigan's wrist with one hand and driving the heel of his other palm into the man's nose. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. Corrigan bellowed in pain, the shot going wide, blasting a hole in the ceiling. The 2 men crashed against the wall, a brutal, primal struggle of strength and will. It was a clash of 2 worlds, the greedy, blustering force of the cattle baron against the silent, deadly efficiency of the warrior. It ended quickly. Hawk twisted Corrigan's arm until the revolver clattered to the floor. Then, with a final desperate heave, Corrigan shoved Hawk backward. Hawk stumbled his healing leg, giving way for a split second. It was the only opening Corrigan needed. He dove for the fallen rifle. But Elspeth was there first. She snatched up the heavy Hawken, and without a moment's hesitation, swung it like a club, putting all her weight behind it. The heavy stock connected with the side of Corrigan's head with a sickening thud. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor like a felled ox, unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the fading shouts of the retreating thugs outside. Elspeth stood over Corrigan's body, the rifle clutched in her hands, her whole body trembling. Hawk pushed himself to his feet, a dark shape in the gloom. He looked at her then, at the unconscious form of Corrigan, and then back to her. A new light was in his eyes, not of prophecy, not of duty, but of profound and adulterated respect. Outside, the sun began to rise, casting a pale grey light on a homestead that had been tested by fire and blood and had survived. The first rays of dawn painted the bruised sky in strokes of pale pink and orange, illuminating the carnage. The homestead was a wreck. The ground was littered with spent shell casings, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. 2 of Corrigan's men lay dead in the dirt, their bodies stark and still in the morning light. The others had vanished. Pautehau and his warriors were tending to their horses near the creek. They had bound the unconscious Corrigan with rawhide strips, his fate yet to be decided. As Elspeth stepped out of the cabin, Pautehau looked at her. The open hostility in his eyes was gone, replaced by a grudging, hard-won respect. He had witnessed her courage, had seen her fight for her home and for his brother. He gave her a short, stiff nod, a gesture that spoke volumes more than words ever could. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. Elspeth walked through the debris, her body aching, her mind numb. She surveyed the splintered walls of her cabin, the bullet-riddled water barrel, the trampled earth of her garden. Everything she and Thomas had built, everything she had fought to maintain, had been nearly destroyed in a single night. Hawk came to stand beside her. He had a fresh cut on his forearm, and his limp was more pronounced, but he stood tall. He followed her gaze, seeing not just the destruction, but the foundation that remained. "It stands," he said, his voice quiet. "Barely," she replied, her own voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. A wave of despair washed over her. It was too much. The fight, the loneliness, the constant struggle. She felt tears welling in her eyes and fought them back fiercely. She would not cry. Not now. Hawk saw the tremor in her chin. He took a step closer, and for the first time, he reached out. Not with the reverence of a man touching a prophecy, but with the simple grounding touch of a partner. His hand rested gently on her shoulder. "My people have a saying." He began his English careful, deliberate. He had been learning, listening, and now he chose his words with precision. "A lodge pole that bends in the wind doesn't break. It grows stronger at the root." He looked at the cabin. "This is a strong lodge." He looked at her. "You are a strong root." He was no longer speaking of visions or destiny. He was speaking of her strength, her spirit. He had seen it, and he honored it. The vision of Setanta. He continued, his voice dropping. It showed a path, but a path is not a cage. A man can choose to walk it, or he can choose to find another. He paused, and his dark eyes searched hers. "The prophecy said you would be my mate. That is the word of the spirits. But that is not my word." Elspeth turned to face him fully, her surprise evident. "My word," he said, his gaze unwavering, "is that I see a woman with a heart as fierce as the fire in her hair. I see a woman who fought for me when I was helpless. I see a woman who stood against our enemies when she was afraid. I do not ask for the woman in a vision. I ask for Elspeth Monroe." He wasn't claiming her. He wasn't fulfilling a destiny. He was asking. He was giving her the choice that his tribe's prophecy had tried to take away. He was offering a partnership, a life to be built not by spiritual decree, but by mutual respect and a shared will to survive. In that moment, standing in the ruins of her old life, Elspeth saw the shape of a new one. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long felt distant, a ghost of a life already lived. The future was no longer a vast, empty prairie stretching out before her. It was a path uncertain and fraught with hardship, but one she would not have to walk alone. She looked at this man, this Kiowa warrior, this hawk, and she saw not a stranger or a savior, but an equal, a partner, a man who had earned her trust and her respect, just as she had earned his. A slow smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile in what felt like an eternity. "The lodge pole is strong," she said, her voice clear and steady, "but it will need some repairs." A corresponding smile transformed Hawk's face, erasing the last traces of the grim warrior and revealing the man beneath. "We will repair it," he said. "Together." From the ridge, Setanta watched them. He saw the two of them, a man and a woman from different worlds, standing together, amidst the wreckage, already planning how to rebuild. He saw his brother, Pautehau, leading the captive Corrigan away. The feud ended, an alliance forged in blood and fire. The shaman smiled. His vision had not been wrong. The spirits had merely shown him the destination. They had wisely left the journey with all its trials and choices to the strength of the human heart. And so, on the vast, sun-scorched plains of Texas, a new story began. Not one of prophecy fulfilled, but of two souls from different worlds choosing to build a single future. Elspeth Monroe and the warrior called Hawk rebuilt her homestead, not just with sod and wood, but with a foundation of mutual respect and hard-won trust. Their life was never easy, a constant negotiation between two cultures under one roof, but it was theirs. They carved out a space between the encroaching world of the settlers and the fading world of the Kiowa, a testament to the idea that even in the harshest of landscapes, the strongest bonds are not decreed by fate, but forged by choice. If this story of survival defiance and unexpected love in the Wild West captured your imagination, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow history and drama enthusiasts, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the American frontier. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.